Hello, Indian Creek 8th grade students. This is Mr. Roush with our new unit, The Jazz Age. Part 1 is going to be The Time of Turmoil. Our guiding question is, why were some Americans prejudiced towards foreigners and African Americans? So think about that while we go through this lesson. During World War I, the United States government had taken away some of the liberties of American citizens. Many people who opposed the nation's role in the war were arrested. After the war, an atmosphere of distrust remained. Tired of war and world responsibilities, Americans were eager to return to normal life. They grew more and more suspicious of foreigners, foreign ideas, and those who held different views from their own. About the same time, the Russian Revolution deeply disturbed many of the Americans. As you recall, in World War I, the Bolsheviks took control of Russia in November of 1917 and began establishing a communist state. So the Bolsheviks took control of Russia and encouraged others to overthrow capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system based on private property and free enterprise, where the money goes to whoever owns the business and it doesn't go towards the state or the country. Many Americans feared that Bolshevism threatened American government and institutions. They also feared anarchists, which are people who believe there should be no government. There were a series of anarchist bombings in 1919 that frightened Americans. There was a number of public officials, mayors, judges, and the Attorney General of the United States who received packages containing bombs. This here is a picture of a bomb that went off in 1920 in front of the J.P. Morgan headquarters in New York. And many of these anarchists were foreign-born and contributed to the fear of foreigners. This wave of fear led to the Red Scare, a period when the government went after Reds, or communists, and also others with radical views. In late 1919 and early 1920, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and his deputy, J. Edgar Hoover, ordered the arrest of people suspected of being communist and anarchists. Palmer and Hoover also staged raids on the headquarters of various suspicious groups. In the raids, the government arrested more than 4,000 people, ransacked homes and offices, and seized records. They did not find any large stockpiles of weapons or dynamite, which they claimed they were looking for. Fear of immigrants and radical ideas surfaced in a criminal case in Massachusetts in 1920. Two men robbed a shoe factory and killed 2 people. Soon afterwards, the police arrested Italian immigrants Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti for the crime. The 2 men were tried and convicted in July of 1921 and were sentenced to death. The Sacco and Vanzetti case was an interesting one. Neither man had a criminal record, but both men were anarchists, and Sacco owned a pistol similar to the murder weapon. There wasn't very much evidence, but Americans demanded that the death sentence be carried out. And in 1927, a special commission appointed to the governor of Massachusetts upheld the verdict. Sacco and Vanzetti, proclaiming their innocence, were executed. Many historians continue to debate the verdict of the case, but it suggested the depth of feelings against foreigners and radicals in the United States in the 1920s. During World War I, labor and management had put aside their differences for a sense of patriotism, high wages, and wartime laws kept conflict to a minimum. When the war ended, that's when the conflicts happened. American workers demanded increases in wages to keep up with the rapidly rising prices. They launched more than 2,500 strikes in 1919, and many of the strikes were blamed on the Bolsheviks and the radicals and their ideas. The largest strike in U.S. history so far was the steelworker strike. The steelworkers demanded higher wages and an 8-hour workday. There was about 350,000 steelworkers that went on strike. Using propaganda techniques learned during the war, the steel companies started a campaign against the strikers. In newspaper ads, they accused the strikers of being red agitators. Charges of communism cost the strikers much-needed public support and helped force them to end the strike. but not before violence had occurred on both sides. There was 18 strikers died in a riot in Gary, Indiana. In 1919, police officers in Boston went on strike, demanding the right to form a union. The strike by public employees angered many Americans, and they applauded the strong stand Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge took against the strikers. Coolidge was quoted saying, "There is no right to strike against the public safety of anybody, anywhere, anytime." The result of the strike was that all Boston police officers were fired, and most Americans approved that decision. Workers found themselves deeper in debt because of rising prices and unchanged wages. Still, labor unions failed to win wide support among working families. During this period of union decline, a dynamic African American, A. Philip Randolph, started the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This union was made up mostly of African Americans, and they were railroad workers that struggled during the early years but began to grow in the 1930s. A. William Randolph would become a leader of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. During World War I, over 500,000 African Americans moved north to work. Where the whites resented African Americans for their competition for the jobs, when the soldiers came back from serving overseas, they wanted their jobs back, but they were already taken. These rising racial tensions led to violence, and many people died. In the South, more than 70 African Americans were lynched. In Chicago, a violent riot broke out after a group of whites stoned an African American youth who was swimming in Lake Michigan. The youth drowned, and the incident set off rioting. For 2 weeks, African Americans and white gangs roamed city streets, attacking each other and burning buildings. The riots left 15 whites and 23 African Americans dead and more than 500 people injured. Not everybody wanted to integrate the African Americans and the whites. Marcus Garvey opposed integration. He supported a Back to Africa movement where African Americans would move back to Africa and establish their own country. He also founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1914 to promote racial unity and pride. This association helped African Americans start businesses. One African American newspaper summed up Garvey's achievements as he taught African Americans to admire and praise black things and black people. So that brings us back to our guiding question. Why were some Americans prejudiced towards foreigners and African Americans? Well, that's all we have for today. Tune in next time. We'll have the next part of the video, and have a great day.